great pleasure to be with the Indian Embassy in Seoul and with all the participants in this event. My mission today is to share with you a perspective on India's disarmament positions. Now, I do so as a practitioner. I have worked in this area for nearly 2 decades on behalf of India, but also on behalf of the United Nations forums in the area of disarmament. I also do so as an academic, as a researcher. In 2008, I started to develop an interest in researching disarmament questions and writing about them. It ended up in a PhD and a book which describes the history of the nuclear security summits. That process included a summit in Seoul, if some of the participants might recall. So I bring those perspectives to you today. The topic that's been given to me is India's positions on disarmament. How does India see the notion of disarmament, the idea of disarmament? What are its constraints? What are the compulsions under which it pursues that notion? What are some of the initiatives that it has undertaken? And where are we today on some of the big disarmament questions? As you know, this field has become very complex in recent years, with the DPRK developing a nuclear weapons capability, demonstrating it, with tensions amongst the major powers, with the traditional arms control negotiations between the US and Russia having run aground, and there have been no negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament since the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was concluded in 1996. So it's a very complex, very challenging field today. These complexities are accentuated, increased by developments in technology. We are all used to looking at weapon systems as discrete objects, as physical objects. Today, with cyber weapons and with the increasing use of artificial intelligence systems in weapon systems, whether it is for decision support or it is in actual systems that sense targets, that track targets and that engage them, there is a shift underway. There are more complexities being generated as different domains of security come together thanks to technology. So it's with this backdrop that I will take you through India's positions on disarmament. And please don't hesitate to send me your questions, your comments in the chat. We'll of course have a separate question and answer session. Remember, I am a professor as well as an ambassador. So I'm used to taking questions from the class, and the more provocative the questions, the better I feel that the lesson has had some impact. I had prepared some slides for the session today. They are just a crutch. They are just a support for me. So I might kind of use them quite liberally. But here they are. So I'm going to present my screen to you. And I want to start by giving you a kind of sense of how national security comes into the domain of disarmament. Disarmament does not sit separately from a nation's priorities. And nation's priorities, in the case of the Republic of Korea or the Republic of India, are mostly similar. So a big priority is national security. So there are, in the case of India, in the case of ROK or other states, there are these notions of national security that enter the calculus, the calculations of leaders. There is the notion of development as well. And here I want to pause for a second. You'll say, what has development got to do with disarmament? There are two ways in which development is impacted by this field. One is development requires peace and security to be pursued. The other is that development requires a set of enablers, which includes technology. For a developing country to go to the next level of economic development, technology is essential. And technology has become linked with disarmament issues from the beginning. So some of the choices that countries make about civil nuclear energy, for example, there is a security component and then there is a development component. So for India, this relationship of disarmament with development, with technology choices, has been critical from the beginning. Now, if you look at the national security aspect of nuclear weapons, for example, the United States was the sole possessor for a while, and then the Soviet Union followed and other countries followed. The NPT was finalized in July 1968, and there is an article in the NPT that commits the NPT parties to nuclear disarmament. India stayed away from the NPT. The reasons were related to national security. India did not want to be forced to make a choice between being a nuclear weapon state and a non-nuclear weapon state. So at that time, it wanted to keep its choice open. It paid a price for that because the reigning wisdom at that time was that you had to make a choice one way or the other. India did not want to do that. And also there was an aspect of national security. In India's neighborhood in Asia, nuclear weapons had been developed. So it would have been imprudent, it wouldn't have been prudent for India to give up its option at that stage. But India, in its positions, even at that time, made it clear that it would abide by the articles of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as it applied to the other states in the context of the NPT. And later it made it clear as it applied to nuclear weapon states. So not to proliferate, not to transfer nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons related technology to others, to conduct civil nuclear work under IAEA safeguards, and also to be committed to the elimination of nuclear weapons and to take measures, to take steps towards that. So it's not enough just to be committed to something. You have to demonstrate that commitment through concrete steps. So India has maintained a commitment to the NPT's articles as they apply to nuclear weapon states, even without being a member of the NPT. A capability to make nuclear weapons was demonstrated by India in 1974. So there were reasons, geopolitical reasons, some even say domestic political reasons. I mean, there are certain scholars in the West say that this was because of domestic organizational politics, etc. I mean, I don't subscribe to that, but for you to know that that view is out there. Certainly geopolitical reasons related to the birth of Bangladesh, how India found itself in a sense in a position of being kind of caught between the superpowers and the major powers. So it was a demonstration of capability, but India still exercised restraint in terms of developing its own nuclear weapons. So this restraint lasted about 20 plus years. And this, the threshold of being a nuclear weapon state was crossed in 1998 after the finalization of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Here, the choice was more technological or technology driven, because to be able to maintain an arsenal, you need some testing data. And that data was crucial. There had been a while since the capability demonstration had occurred. technology had moved on. So I would say while the underlying national security rationale remained as much, the overwhelming aspect at this time was the aspect of technology. And since then, there have been a number of other developments that have impacted on India's consideration of nuclear weapons and national security. There is continued modernization and development of nuclear weapons in Asia. There is a continued development of delivery systems. And this proliferation was an additional factor in the mid-1990s as India considered the option of deploying nuclear weapons. So, for example, in early 1998, Pakistan tested the Gauri missile, which was nothing but the DPRK Nodong or Rodong missile. So therefore, these proliferation networks across the globe, whereby missile technology traveled in one direction and uranium enrichment or other technologies, nuclear weapons related technologies traveled in the other direction, also made an impact on our thinking. And these developments led, as the participants are well aware, to the withdrawal of DPRK from the NPT. The Iran nuclear issue became very prominent in around 2003. And then this leads us to some of the issues that I highlighted right at the beginning of my lecture today. Can we please go to the next slide? This is just the background in which we should consider India's historical background, which we should consider India's disarmament. Yes. So I mentioned the commitment to nuclear disarmament, and this was an article of faith for Mahatma Gandhi, who was really shocked by the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Nehru was further disturbed, concerned by the atmospheric testing that had started to happen in the 1950s. You'd recall the Bikini Atoll test, which led to a lot of fallout and the radiation affected some Japanese fishermen. So he proposed a standstill agreement on nuclear testing in 1954. But that did not lead, unfortunately, at that time into a comprehensive test ban. Only a partial test ban was agreed in 1963 between the powers that were testing at that time. And even then, China was not part of that agreement. India followed up with proposals on a genuine non-proliferation instrument where there is a balance of obligations between weapon states and non-weapon states. But the NPT, as I mentioned earlier, the way it turned out did not suit India's interests. I would like to then pause for a second on the 1988 action plan, which remains till date, despite the change of different governments in India, a kind of article of faith, because this action plan proposed a phased elimination of all nuclear weapons within a specified time frame. This also became the position of the non-aligned movement, and therefore is an important aspect of India's positions historically. Nuclear disarmament is a complex exercise. You cannot wave a magic wand one day and have weapons disappear the next day. So how it is phased, how it is programmed, which states come in and how, without disturbing the overall security balance, that is part of the thinking that went into this action plan. Let's go to the next slide, please. And many of these positions were taken collectively with other states, like, for a long time, Mexico, Sweden, Myanmar, some other countries were part of this group to which India belonged. And I have mentioned the larger NAM. And within the context of the Conference on Disarmament, a group called the Group of 21. Now, you would ask me, was there a shift after India declared itself a nuclear weapon state in 1998? In terms of nuclear disarmament, there was no shift at all. So we remain the only nuclear weapon state committed to negotiating a nuclear weapons convention. So we specifically said so. And in terms of how to get there, we've also outlined, as I mentioned, the 1988 plan, but then also in 2007, we presented some ideas, specific ideas at the Conference on Disarmament. They have been followed up subsequently with more concrete suggestions. They can be described as a preference for the path of delegitimization. So let me just explain what that is. So nuclear weapons, as I said, cannot be waved away with a magic wand. So you need to reduce their role in national security, in international security calculations. They play a role, I mean, let's admit it. On the Korean Peninsula, the extended deterrence that ROK enjoys due to its relationship with the United States plays a role in terms of the security calculations. So you cannot just take it away like that. You have to take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrines, in postures, national security postures. And these include steps such as de-alerting, where it is not easy to launch nuclear weapons. The deterrence is there, and there is a lot of evidence that you don't need to be on a launch on warning or a launch ready posture of any kind to be able to exercise the deterrence. So India's position is, let's take steps to bring down the value of nuclear weapons in security, not just take it away overnight, but bring it down. And then obviously, we are cautious about partial NPT-linked approaches. So we don't think, for example, that the CTBT is a step towards nuclear disarmament. It is important to maintain moratoria on nuclear testing. So if testing, for example, resumes on the Korean Peninsula, it is not a good thing. It's dangerous for nuclear proliferation. It will have negative consequences. But at the same time, the treaty itself is not a way to reach nuclear disarmament. So there is no nuclear disarmament related step in that treaty. Likewise, we need to see more steps by the largest possessors. Still, more than 85% of the nuclear weapons that we see today belong to two states. So they need to take further steps, and they have a big responsibility that they need to discharge. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is, I think we've skipped one, but I won't dwell long on this slide. This is just a big picture view of India's nuclear policy. So no first use is an important aspect. There have been tensions on the border with Pakistan, with China, and sometimes commentators say that, oh, look, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, India is a nuclear weapon state, China is a nuclear weapon state. But at least in the case of India, there is a clear commitment to no first use. So we have a posture that says that nuclear weapons will only be used in retaliation against a nuclear attack on Indian territory or on Indian forces anywhere. So it's not a kind of aggressive stance with nuclear weapons. And of course, there is the clear commitment to non-use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. And in India, because India is a democracy, because there has been a tradition of strict civilian control over the armed forces, so there is a clear chain of command that goes to the top civilian leadership in India. So this thing has not been this strategic weapons use aspect has not been delegated away to the armed forces. And part of our restrained posture is reflected in strict controls on the arsenal itself, on nuclear security. And then in international terms, it is reflected in our strict controls on exports. So India has had, even without being part of the NPT, and for a long time, even without being part of the nuclear export control regimes. Today, the situation is different. India is a member of 3 of the 4 major export control regimes and is committed through the 2008 understanding with the NSG on the NSG's restraints. So there is a formal commitment there as well. So today the situation is different, but even when this was not so, India has maintained strict controls on exports of nuclear and nuclear delivery systems related materials and technologies. And I have mentioned earlier the commitment to the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world and steps in that direction, including negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty, which to my mind is a very, very important instrument going forward. We need to, before we can start reducing arsenals, we need to stop building them up. Before we can get to safeguards on disarmament, we need to make sure that different aspects of nuclear fuel cycles are well separated, something which India has done, and that they are under some kind of an Indian international verification system. Let's go to the next slide, please. These are some of the diplomatic initiatives that India has taken at the UN. I have mentioned the working paper on nuclear disarmament of 2006, which was taken to the UNGA in 2007. And then these resolutions that continue to be introduced on a yearly basis. Another resolution that I have not listed here is the one on terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction. So after the 9/11 attacks, India was the first country to highlight this concern because of its own experience with terrorism and the fact that there have been these proliferation cases which have involved non-state actors. So to my mind, this is one of the most horrendous scenarios that we can envisage, because states at the end of the day can still be deterred. There are certain restraints that there are, there are costs that you can inflict on them. So you can compel restraint. But with non-state actors, this calculus starts to break down. And we've seen the kind of risks that non-state actors can take or go to, suicide bombings of all kinds. So therefore, it's very, very important that this particular aspect of nuclear security, nuclear proliferation through these networks, through these connections that link with state elements who have some access to nuclear materials, nuclear knowledge, be strictly controlled. Next slide, please. I want to dwell a little bit on this aspect of technologies for development. I had mentioned it at the beginning as an important aspect alongside the national security aspect. India, for example, needs energy for growth. So the energy intensity of our growth, of our development is still low, even compared with middle income countries. So therefore, we need to grow our energy basket, but we need to do so in a responsible manner. So if India sets up more coal power plants or more plants based on fossil fuels, then it not only complicates life for itself in the future in terms of sustainability, but also for the entire world, given the size of India, given the size of its requirements. So there's been a conscious policy to develop non-polluting sources of energy, including solar energy, wind power, where India has made massive strides. But we also need a certain base load of nuclear power, because wind energy, other forms of energy, there are issues of stability of the supply of the grid, and you need baseload components like hydropower and nuclear power, which is where we see a role for nuclear power. So nuclear power is not the answer, the only answer to our energy problem, but it's a critical component of that answer. So that's why India has its own technologies. It was the first country in Asia to have a reactor go critical. So that's not the question. The capability is not the question, but the capacity certainly is. So there was, for example, a reduction in our access to uranium-based fuel, so which had an impact on the utility factor in our nuclear power reactors. Likewise, we would like to move on from the current scale of about 500 to 700 megawatts of energy generation per reactor unit to the prevalent scale reactors of Arriva, Westinghouse, and others, or for that matter, Rosatom. They go to the 1,000, 1,100 scale. So these were some of the considerations that led to what is called the Civil Nuclear Initiative, with a joint statement between the Indian and US leaders. It led to a series of reciprocal commitments. So India put some things on the table in terms of bringing its civilian nuclear program under IEA safeguards. And in reciprocity, the international community, recognizing India's responsible conduct on matters nuclear, no proliferation, strict export controls, further commitment to nuclear disarmament, decided to grant it a unique exemption to the nuclear supplier group's rules for commerce with countries that are not party to the NPT. This exemption then led to agreements with countries such as the US, France, Russia, and others. And part of that process has led to membership of the MTCR, the Australia Group, and the Wassenaar arrangement. So this has been a complex negotiation. In some aspects, it's still going on, and some aspects have been resolved only recently. For example, the civil nuclear liability issue was resolved in 2015, 2016. But overall, the trend is more reactors under safeguards, more restraint, more commitments from the Indian side, and a recognition of that by the international community in terms of increased opening to India. I have not mentioned the agreements with Japan and Australia here. For Japan, this was a unique step to have a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with a non-NPT state. So this is a kind of a tribute to the sagacity on both sides to recognize India's unique position in this regard. I want to conclude now. Let's have time for more time for questions and answers by just speaking a little bit about other weapon systems. So we spoke about disarmament in general, we spoke about nuclear weapons, but there are treaties on other weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical weapons. So India is a party to both those treaties. Under the Chemical Weapons Convention, India sometimes hosts the largest number of inspections given the extent of its chemical industry. In the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, we, in a sense, the last review conference had failed to reach agreement due to differences between Iran and the US in particular. So India chaired the meeting of state parties in 2017 that led to a consensus agreement which brought everyone together on a new program of work and led to a kind of a rescue of the convention, if I may put it this way. And then I like to end by mentioning new developments on the conventional weapons side. Of course, there are instruments such as the UN Register on Conventional Arms, UNROCA, which aim at increasing transparency on conventional weapons transfers, tanks, helicopters, attack helicopters, naval vessels, etc. But then there is this aspect of weapon systems that can take life in an inhumane way or not be subject to international humanitarian law. These are dealt with under a convention called Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, CCW, in Geneva. India is a high contracting party, a member of this convention, as is the ROK. So ROK and India, in fact, have very similar positions on many issues within the CCW. There, in recent years, the focus has been on lethal autonomous weapon systems. So India chaired the lethal autonomous weapon systems negotiations in 2017 and 2018 and led the convention successfully to the consensus adoption of a set of principles, 10 principles, and subsequently one more principle has been added that should govern how states should bring in artificial intelligence systems into weapon systems. There is no ban as such because artificial intelligence is like electricity. It is a universal purpose technology. It has very important applications for development. So again, going back to our initial discussion about security, development, technology access. So AI, I have a friend in ROK who runs a very important fintech. So risk assessment through artificial intelligence. It's a very important aspect of growth in the financial sector today. So you cannot ban the technology straight away. So there need to be some principles, some understanding around how it is to be used in the security space. And this is what India contributed to in 2017 and 2018. And I was privileged to be the chair of the negotiations during those 2 years. So if there are questions going beyond the nuclear dimension or the weapons of mass destruction dimension, and which impinge on these latest generation of emerging technologies, hypersonics, or AI systems, or cyber weapons, so I'll be happy to take those questions. So I hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Gill, for your fascinating lecture and outlining India's nuclear policy and its stand on disarmament. Very aptly, you have summarized the diplomatic initiatives taken by India in the United Nations and also the efforts towards civil nuclear deal for national security of the country. We will now open the floor for discussion. Meanwhile, we also have our Ambassador Sri Priya Ranganathan with us. So may I request ma'am to please respond, and then later we will take up the questions.
Aman, as expected, that was an amazing overview of various aspects of India's disarmament policy. I know that I could have listened to you for at least another couple of hours, if not longer. So, and I know that many of our Korean friends in particular will have some questions to ask. But if I can just as you had hinted at the start of your presentation, if I can ask you one of the more provocative questions, and this is something which has been asked of me. So from some of the experts in disarmament at the Korean end, one is, do you really see in the foreseeable future, in our lifetime, if you will, a world which will genuinely be free of nuclear weapons? I mean, is that a dream? Is that a mirage? Is that a goal that we can still aspire towards? How do you see? I know you mentioned the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, but how do you see that really playing out in the current situation that we live in, where those who have threat perceptions, or those who have in a sense responsible approach, are also accompanied by those who have a less responsible approach. And you hinted again at proliferation as being one of the biggest challenges that we have faced. I think the aspect of nuclear security is another angle that we would really love to hear you speak about. And and the very precise question that has often been asked of me is that if the world is so unhappy with the DPRK and the kind of path that it has adopted towards securing nuclear weapons, would you not say that this was in a way a path that has been created or inspired by countries like India, which remained outside the NPT and which chose to exercise the option that we felt we needed to exercise at that point? So I will leave you with these few points, Aman, and thank you once again for a fantastic overview, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shripriya. Excellent questions, tough questions. Let me start with the DPRK question and then go to this larger question of, is nuclear disarmament possible? The optimism versus the pessimism. DPRK in some ways is a unique case because unlike India, it had signed the NPT. So it took a conscious decision to give up its nuclear weapons option and sign the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, took on commitments related to not developing nuclear weapons, not proliferating, having all its nuclear facilities under safeguards. So this notion of comprehensive safeguards. Now then it changed its mind. It withdrew from the NPT. And that act itself is still controversial. So within the NPT, there are views whether that's legally tenable, etc. So again, a very unique situation. So I do not think that the DPRK case can be compared in any way with India's case, where India had not taken on any legal obligations not to develop nuclear weapons. So it's a very clear distinction in international law between the DPRK case and the India case. That said, you can always construct a political moral argument, but that argument does not extend only to India. It extends to all weapon states. So that argument is that if you guys can rely on nuclear weapons for your security, so why cannot I? So, I mean, here we are on slightly contentious ground. On international law aspects, I'm very clear, and I think scholars should be very clear in making that distinction. But now we come to the political arguments, where I think the problem is nuclear weapons exist because they exist. And I'm not trying to philosophize this, but once they were developed, then there was an incentive for other states, at least some states, which felt an existential threat to develop nuclear weapons. So that's the situation under which we should look at the DPRK aspect. So the answer to this essentially is a nuclear disarmament, the elimination of nuclear weapons everywhere. So it cannot be, the answer can no longer be that you have kind of unilateral disarmament or bilateral disarmament or some disarmament and not others. So the ultimate answer is the elimination of all nuclear weapons, because they have become they have spread beyond what people had imagined. They would spread in terms of regions, if not number of countries. And they are meshed with some challenging issues of not just territoriality, but existential aspects of existence. Coming back to now, you might also ask me, what about other countries? Today or in the future, they may also face some kind of an existential threat. But there again, there is outside of the NPT regime, there is the regime of alliances and extended deterrence. So with Japan, with ROK, that comes into play. So in an indirect way, or with NATO countries such as Germany, it comes into play. So with an indirect connection to nuclear deterrence. We can again debate it because things are shifting. These alliance commitments have come under question in many parts of the world. But I think this is an aspect that needs to be brought into the debate when you start comparing India with another country, etc. Now, the larger question of whether disarmament is possible. See, at one stage, I was very optimistic. Personally speaking, in the, I think, early 2000s, even though, there was a walk back from some treaty commitments, but, the world seemed different at that time. And when President Obama took the reign initially, his Prague speech, etc., again, a lot of optimism. And it's interesting that in 2010, when President Obama had his summit with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in India, in the joint statement, there is a reference to elimination of nuclear weapons within the century. So although he did not give a specific date in Prague, in the joint statement in Delhi, there is this reference to within the century. So 2010, which means latest by 2100, we should get rid of nuclear weapons. And later on, some US administration officials tried to kind of, explain that away. But I think even 2100 is a very long timeline. To me, that remains the outer timeline. So if somehow we can achieve this within this century, not carry this this complexity into the next century, that would be great. So within the next 8 years. But many others in the NGO community feel this is too long. So there has been a new treaty that's been negotiated, the ban treaty, let's call it the N-PT, nuclear prohibition treaty, where you have a certain number of states who decided that we will just ban it. Whether the nuclear weapon states or those states who enjoy extended deterrence are part of it or not, we will just create this as a moral instrument, as an instrument of political pressure. So this shows you the impatience with these kind of timelines, this step-by-step approach. That's been the reigning approach within the NPT. Doesn't seem to be working very well today. So again, I have not answered your question, but maybe let me just speculate a little bit. How can we get to nuclear disarmament faster? When I took my first academic break, so I was part of a project called Project Base Camp, which looked at the base camp before the final climb to the summit. And in this case, the climb to the summit is getting to a world without nuclear weapons. So a set of us, scholars from around the world, Russian, American, British, Israeli, unfortunately, there was no Chinese or Pakistani in that group. That would have been valuable. But we looked at different ways of getting to the base camp. And the way I adopted was the delegitimization path, given my Indian DNA and the thinking around, this, the de-alerting, etc. Others took other paths. And there was one path I remember, which was around some kind of a catastrophic event. Oh yes, it was Bruno Tertre, the French scholar of nuclear weapons, who started with some kind of a non-state actor-driven event. So his sense was, the world will wake up only when there is a disaster. So then there will be this kind of a moral outrage that everyone will say, I put this out there, but I don't think that's the way the world should plan things. Having a disaster and then doing something about a problem. I think it should be more systematic. So in my view, re-engagement of the major powers, dialogue among the nuclear weapons possessors, critical steps like the fissile material cutoff treaty, some delegitimization steps. Some people have views about delegitimization, that it disturbs deterrence. but we can start somewhere. That would start to kind of shorten this time span from 80 years to, let's say, 30 to 40 years, which gives countries the time to plan their national security choices. ROK, for example, it's in a difficult situation. So this kind of a time horizon, a kind of a new, let me put it this way, a new revised Rajiv Gandhi action plan. So within a specified time frame, that was supposed to run out in 2010. So kind of a 22-year type of a time frame. So if we could have another one like that with a more stretched out 35, 40-year time frame, which allows countries to plan their national security for a world without nuclear weapons. So that would be, my answer, direct answer to your question.
Thank you, Ambassador Gill, for your response. And I think now we can take some of the questions. Our participants have already raised their hands. So may I request Miss Larissa?
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Trivedi. And I'm sorry because I come from Russia and maybe I'm not directly related to this workshop, but I'm always given the honor to ask the first question. So I'm a little bit embarrassed, but thank you very much. And the question I have, I come from Russia and I lived in China for 10 years. And yesterday we discussed China here a lot. And today, maybe because you are very far from China now, you are in Geneva. So when you are in Geneva, you see things a little bit differently, because Europe is very safe. But now the changes, they are in that part of the world, in China. And you mentioned Korea, of course, DPRK. But basically, my question is like this. You said you are also a professor. And when I went to university and I studied for foreign diplomacy, we were taught how things are. We were taught, okay, the disarmament policy in the UN is like this. Basically what you were saying today, that it is a value. We are going there, maybe not so fast, maybe by 21, maybe by the 22nd century, whatever, but we are going in that direction. And then I went to China and I was doing my PhD there. And then I realized they don't teach things in this way. And their paradigms, they come from the United States. But the Chinese professors reinterpret them, of course, according to the national interest of China. But the paradigms come from the US. And they teach like this. For example, I think the American academic who invented this theory is Waltz, like one of those international relations theorists, you will know better than me. And the position of this academic is that basically if every country in the world possesses nuclear weapons, it is going to be even safer for everybody. So this academic, he questions the whole idea of disarmament. And I was very shocked because I was like, that's not what we were taught. That's not how things are supposed to work. That's just basically, that's what, like in the national relations we say, agreements should be respected, right? Pacta sunt servanda, that's what we were taught. But this academic, just by his imagination, and he questions the whole system of disarmament. And then, but if you look at practice, right? If you look at practice, then Russia was trying to carry out the disarmament agreements, and then you know what happened. And Ukraine is a more blatant example because Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum and agreed to withdraw nuclear weapons. That was the condition of the independence of Ukraine. And then you see what happened.
Ambassador Gill, let's take a couple of more questions and then you can respond to them all together. Ms. Mehta, Ms. Dipal Mehta.
Yeah, hello sir, my name is Dipal Mehta. I am an Indian representative for Culture and Arts at the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism at the Korean government. Sir, my question for you is like, according to your statement regarding the artificial intelligence in terms of national security, what are your thoughts on the unethical hacking and cyber terrorism? Like, as everyone knows that India is advanced in information technology for cyber security. So how can we deal with the cyber terrorism and how important it is?
Umesh Bhatt.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for your nice session. This year, I am going to start my graduation with cybersecurity along with preparation for Intelligence Bureau of India. As we all know nowadays, in this digital world, cyber attacks are at the peak, and these attacks acts as a invisible weapons for us. So in your opinion, what measures should be taken to reduce those attacks, and what should be the role of a student like me who are pursuing cybersecurity? Thank you.
You can respond to these questions, Ambassador, and then we will take up next round later.
Sure. So the first question, if I understand, it is more like, the different ways of looking at the notion of disarmament. Yes, that will always be there. Nations will interpret these broad terms, these international concerns in their own manner. And yes, they will, as Ken Waltz, the Larissa mentioned this scholar, they will do so from a realist perspective. So Ken Waltz is a famous realist, and there is a famous debate between him and Scott Sagan. So the Waltz-Sagan debate on, do more nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon states lead to more security or less security? So there is that debate. In some ways, it's a very academic debate because it's caricature. You take two extreme positions, and this is how it happens in academia. But in other ways, it's an interesting debate. And my own position is somewhere in the middle, in the sense that I do not consider the aspect of proliferation as immoral, or, I don't take an ideological stance on this, but I take a very practical stance. How is this happening? Where is it happening? What are the conditions? What are the risks? And can we manage those risks? So I look at it as a practitioner. And there you see differences. You see differences between the position of Russia and the positions of China and the position of DPRK, position of Pakistan. And you have to deal with it in a practical sense. So having everyone develop nuclear weapons, I don't think that's a recipe for greater security for everyone. So there I disagree with Ken Waltz. But just saying that proliferation is bad is just an ideological slogan. Yes, it may be bad, but what do we do about it? How do we go about this, etc. And then I didn't catch the rest of the where our distinguished participant was headed. But if there are commitments, there are legal commitments, they should be respected. And if everyone starts violating those commitments, then the motivation to enter into further commitments also reduces. And this is an argument that our Russian friends have made recently. On the cyber terrorism questions, and both those questions were similar. This is an area where the traditional multilateral forums are struggling a bit. There are two processes currently underway, an open-ended working group and a GG. There've been 5 GGs so far, and so these are small group discussions. They have agreed on some principles that should apply to cyber capabilities, but progress is slow, and there are deep differences between Russia and China on the one hand, US and its allies on the others, many others like France and India having very specific positions. The answer, what should students do or what should governments do? The answer really, in practical terms, is a lot of cyber hygiene, a lot of awareness of the risks and the problems, and building the capacity to respond to these kind of attacks. So I know that there is a gap in terms of trained cybersecurity professionals of several million, actually. The world needs 2-3 million more cybersecurity professionals today. So that should be an immediate priority. When I was in the United Nations, we looked at it from the perspective of the UN. And this is one of the things that we we discovered and we prioritized. The second aspect is working closely with the private sector. The private sector, unlike other cases of nuclear weapons, biochem is different. The industry comes in, but then again as a second step. nuclear again as a second step, nuclear security, safety, etc. Here, industry is the first line of defense. So the attacks first are dealt with by the service providers, the internet service providers, companies such as Microsoft, who have cloud services, etc. So we need to find new ways of working together with the private sector. And the third thing, this relates to isolating, detecting, deterring the bad actors. There we need to develop new attribution capacities. Today, there are very few countries who have attribution capacities. The UK, for example, is a country that has a certain attribution capacity. It can trace attacks. It can speculate on what the origin of that attack could be. But other countries do not have this. And there is no international capacity for attribution. So we need to work towards developing such an attribution capacity. Not in a kind of finger pointing way, you're bad and you are cyber attacking us and you shall be punished. And the sanctions are already coming, not of just the US, but EU is putting sanctions on for cyber attacks. So the world is shifting on this. But I think the attribution problem is more about being able to spotlight the challenges, the problems, the sources of the threat. So apart from handling the attack surface with hygiene, with capacity, we need to look at the sources of attack. We need to look at developing attribution capacities for highlighting those. I'm afraid I won't be able to answer this question of what should we students do, but I think just basic things, hygiene, cyber hygiene, awareness of the importance of data security, and just a more responsible behavior in cyberspace. We often unthinkingly we forward things, etc. So those are the kind of things that we should be aware of.
Thank you, Ambassador Gill. Let's take another round of questions. Mr. Bhagat.
Hello, sir. Myself, Mukesh Bhagat. I'm doing my undergrad from Banaras Hindu University. My question is, how our neighbors think of or feel of our nuclear policy, and how our nuclear policy affected their security doctrine. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sanskriti?
Good afternoon, everyone. So actually, I am pursuing my immune conference, and my topic is allotted to me is disarmament and international security about a country, Cuba. Though I know it's not related to our country, India, are okay, but I still want to get some views from you so that I can enhance my project and get a glance of my project. So can you help me out and give me a brief about my country as allotted to me, Cuba? Sorry for the question. I know it's not related to the topic. Please.
Ambassador Gill, you can respond to these two.
Yes, I think the Cuba question must be given an award for creativity. This is yes. So I'm a little familiar with the MUN process. So good luck with that. Cuba is a very active delegation in disarmament forums. And in particular, I would advise you to look at its positions on the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. There's a very famous historical episode in the BTWC, wherein a crop duster plane apparently flew over Cuba. And there was an impact on the ground, and Cuba alleged that a biological weapon has been used by the US against it. So it led to the first ever and the only ever investigation within the BTWC system. So I would suggest that you look at that. And Cuba has also been very active within the G21 as a NAM country. So it was very committed to the action plan, the NAM action plan, what I described. But in recent years, it has shifted more towards the humanitarian discourse, the ban discourse, along with some of its neighbors like Mexico, which have taken a more forward-leaning position on the ban aspect. So I would not do your homework for you, but I'll give you some ideas. on what do neighbors think and how has their policy been impacted by India's policies? That's a very interesting question. And I think not enough research has been done on it. So this kind of a learning that happens back and forth, for example, I've researched nuclear learning in the multilateral setting. That's my PhD. But these kind of bilateral learning loops, often we only look at it in terms of tit for tat, or who's responsible for what. But I think in an anecdotal way, I can think of a couple of ways in which India's positions have been followed by Pakistan's position. So you see a kind of reflection, sometimes even the language used. So it's a good research question in some ways. But in other ways, often these positions are linked, but in contrasting terms. You have no first use, so I will not have no first use. So again, that's a learning. It's a learning in the reverse direction, but there's an impact. There is a loop that's going there, which we don't know enough about. I mean, similarly, in terms of China, it's even more difficult to find it. With Pakistan, you can, there's a lot of discourse out there which you can analyze as a researcher. But with China, China and India are hesitant to talk about each other as nuclear adversaries. So you will not find data to conduct research, but I'm sure that both countries think about each other's nuclear disarmament-related positions, take them into consideration. So that's
Okay. Ambassador, there are some questions in the chat box, and I'm just trying to read it from the chat box. We can just collect some of them and then you can respond. There is a question. How do you put environment within the debate of security and development while discussing nuclear weapons?
Yes. Yeah. So the aspects of the impact on the environment, it's a good one. There is a almost forgotten convention called the NMOD Convention, the Environmental Modification Convention. So state parties agreed not to, including India, not to develop systems that would massively impact the environment, modify it in some ways. Now, nuclear weapons are certainly one of those weapons that, if used, can alter life on Earth. They can cause mass famine, etc. There are other technologies in the area of geoengineering. Massive shifts to coastline, or tempering with the weather patterns, and you may have seen some Hollywood movies around that. A system of satellites that kind of shapes the weather around the world. We're not there yet, and this is something that people are generally very, very cautious about, but you cannot take it away from your consideration. And in terms of AI in particular, so one of the concerns that I currently work with is duplication of AI. So AI is very energy hungry, so it needs a lot of compute capacity. So a simple query that you enter into Google, and it has got algorithms that kind of help you come up with those great answers very quickly. It takes as much energy as you would need to brew a cup of coffee. So imagine, in health, digital health, an area that I currently work in. So if everyone were to develop their own AI systems, it'd be massive drain on the world's energy resources. And if this starts to go into weapon systems, you can imagine training, deployment, and testing, etc. So this needs to be kept under watch. And another area that I would highlight is that of pathogen modification. So again, that's something, with new technologies such as gene drives, CRISPR-Cas9, you can actually impact generations of organisms through synthetic biology. This was not possible before. And I'm not talking here of stem cell research, which is just one specific ethical aspect of it. But you can modify entire ecosystems through synthetic biology. Now, that for me is something that has to be done very, very carefully. Even if you might say, look, I'm just focusing on this particular species of mosquitoes that is most responsible for causing these deadly diseases in this particular part of the world. So we have to be very careful as humans before modifying ecosystems.
There is another question in the chat box which says, do you think there should be a separate legal instrument or treaty of some sorts to regulate lethal autonomous weapons system? This is in the outset of the legal ambiguities faced in the Geneva Convention and its additional protocols.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The debate is still on. There is an existing legal instrument, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, CCW, which has 5 protocols, including a protocol on blinding laser weapons. So the blinding laser weapons were never deployed, but people were concerned by their use. Some lasers had been used and they had caused some eyesight problems, etc. But so it was a kind of preemptive ban there. Now, there are some members of the 125 high contracting parties to the CCW who think that another protocol, a legally binding protocol, should be negotiated on lethal autonomous weapon systems. There are others who think that this is not a good idea, and instead we should have clarity on applying the existing international humanitarian law, in particular the aspect that the questioner highlighted in the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocol of weapons reviews. So before you deploy a weapon system, you need to conduct a weapons review to ensure that it complies with all your IHL international law related obligations. So there are these 2 schools of thought. There is another school of thought, and if you are more interested, I would refer you to the report of the negotiations in the CCW that I chaired of August 2018. So this is all laid out there. What are the different options? And again, if some of the more scholarly people on the call, they can read my forthcoming piece in the review, which is the ICRC's journal, on what could be the options going forward in terms of development of this legal framework or a politically binding type of an instrument that is placed within the CCW. You see, with treaty making on emerging technology, with international law on emerging technology, there is a problem. And this problem wasn't there before when we were in the world of the Geneva Conventions or even the CCW of 1980, which is that technology today moves very fast. So if you draw a line with a legally binding instrument today, within 18 months is outdated, even less. In the AI field, there's a recent paper. Within 1 year, there are shifts in terms of the dominant technology that's being used for artificial intelligence. So technology moves very fast, and the policy curve is behind the technology curve. So the old way of treaty making, just let's legislate something today and it'll be valid for at least 70 years. That doesn't work with these technologies. So in my piece, in my writings and speeches, I've talked about what could be new ways of dealing with these challenges.
Maybe this can be the last question, though there are a number of them in the chat box. This is related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the question says that the COVID-19 is a natural pandemic, or is it fabricated? Because scientists have their own view and political angle, they have their own. Just wanted to understand and think straight, not driven by media. So your response on this?
Yeah, no, this is a very sensitive question, and there is an inquiry still underway, which the WHO has been entrusted with. So I will not jump the gun and say one thing or the other. I think the concern is, there are three types of concerns. One is just the inability to handle a natural outbreak. Not being able to confine it, letting it spread, etc., through negligence, etc. The other concern is just safety concern. So it's a biosafety, biosecurity issue, which is like, you handling pathogens inside a lab. Maybe you are kind of, modifying some aspects of their pathogenicity or their, virulence, what have you, to try and understand them better, and maybe with the good intention of trying to understand how to control them. And there have been research projects like this in the past and currently undergoing. But somehow your biosafety, biosecurity measures are lax, and that pathogen being experimented upon escapes the lab. So that's the other concern. And the third concern is a malevolent use, that you deliberately tinker with these things, and then you unleash them while protecting yourself, through vaccines, etc. This kind of a possibility is there, but it's very difficult to execute. Things get known. If you do a mass vaccination of your own population or your own army against something, then the word gets out. So it's very, very difficult. So I would like stay in the first two categories, just as a responsible, common sense type of a response, without excluding the third possibility, which is why we have instruments like the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Mind you, it's a 1972 convention, doesn't have a verification regime, so there are big gaps in it. And this is one thing that the world must come to terms with. When before disease X strikes, the next one, when this virus has caused so much havoc, particularly economic havoc, and its CFR is very low. The case fatality rates are quite low, so it doesn't kill as much. Imagine if the CFR was higher, and then we would be in great trouble. So we need to prepare better for the next one. This one was, I think, we failed as a global class on this test.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador, for your brilliant exposition and raising some very, very critical issues related to disarmament and international security. In fact, today we are on our 8th day of this workshop, and we've had discussions on wide range of issues, beginning from the idea of India to Indian philosophy, education, economy, media, foreign policy, India's strategic culture and thinking, and today your lecture on disarmament. So I'm sure our participants must have gained a lot from your lecture and the issues that have been raised. Many thanks for also taking up all the questions. I now invite our head of Chancery, Mr. Kriti Das, to sum up and give the vote of thanks. Over to you, Mr. Kriti.
Thank you, Ambassador Amandeep Gill, for enlightening us with a very informative and interesting talk on today's session on India's perspective on disarmament and international security. Ambassador had covered important aspects on India's role in these complex issues in international security arena, including India's nuclear policy, no first use, steps to reduce nuclear danger pending disarmament, new developments on conventional weapons, etc. Ambassador has also addressed intriguing queries from the participants on diverse topics, including autonomous weapon systems, AI, disarmament in the context of DPRK and the Korean Peninsula, which I'm sure our Korean participants here would surely appreciate. Thank you once again, sir. We look forward to get more opportunities to hear from you in the future too. I would also like to thank our ambassador, Sri Priya Ranganathan, whose leadership and guidance has enabled us to have this workshop on Facets of Modern India possible. I would also like to thank Dr. Sonu Trivedi, Director of Swami Vivekananda Culture Center, for moderating today's session. I also thank all the participants for making this workshop a great success. Once again, I thank you all for your cordial support. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Kriti, for summing up. Thank you all. And thank you, Ambassador Gill, for your time and being so generous with the questions.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Sonu, for moderating it so well. And thank you, Ambassador Ranganathan. Thank you, Shripriya, for the opportunity. Thank you, Kriti, for those warm words of thanks. Take care.
Thank you, sir.